Okay, the next process for our video game is that we are going to create a collectible and provide some actions for our player in the game. So what we need to do first is add in our collectible. So you can go ahead and create any type of object you want. I'm going to use a cube, and I'll zoom in on it and we'll edit it a little bit. I don't want it to be perfectly square, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate it by 45, 45, 45. It's going to look very similar to one of those question marks in Mario Kart. And I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down with my scale tool a little bit, just so it's a little bit smaller than the player. Maybe a little bit more. Something like that looks good. Okay. So now we need to program in some code for some event so that when the player runs into the collectible, it disappears and it looks like the player has collected it. Before we do any of that, we should probably rename our object to collectible. So I'm going to rename it. And we're going to create a script for this collectible. So inside of our scripts folder, we can create a new C# script. And I'm going to call it collectible controller. Let's go ahead and attach this script to our collectible before we forget. So you can either select the collectible, drag the script into the component menu. You can drag the script right into the object in the hierarchy view, or alternately you can go to component, scripts, collectible controller, and it will add it in the component menu here. So any way you like to do it, it'll add the script. And it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't coded anything in the script. So you can edit it either by just double clicking on the script here or going to it on the actual object, hit the gear and click edit script. Go ahead and open that script up and we'll see some basic script writing that the program does for us. Notice the name of the class is right up here that we made, collectible controller. Still inherits by mono behavior, that's what we want. We're not actually going to use this start method, so we can go ahead and get rid of that. We are going to use update, however. We'll save that later. What we need to do is create a method for our collider. So let's talk about colliders here. So each of these objects has its own collider. For example, when I click on the player or the sphere, it has a sphere collider because it's shaped as a sphere. When I click on the cube or the collectible, it has a box collider. If I zoom in on the item, the green edges here is the actual collider. Notice the little check marks next to each component. If I check mark this box, it's basically going to disable it. The checkbox at the top disables the entire object. So that's how you enable or disable the object. We don't want to check mark that. However, if I take off the mesh renderer, which is basically how you see the object, notice that what's left is the green box, and that's the collider of the object. Okay, and you can do vice versa. You could turn on the visibility and then turn off the collider, and you're no longer looking at it. Okay. The player object has the exact same thing, has the sphere collider. If I turn off the mesh renderer, there's the collider for the player sphere. So what we actually want to happen is that the collectible needs to be a trigger because it's going to trigger an event. When the player collider intersects with the collectible collider, something's going to happen. So we need to make sure we check mark this box. Now that we've talked about colliders, let's go ahead and use it in a method. So we need to use the method called onTriggerEnter. If you want to learn more about what this event does, you can highlight it, Control apostrophe as your shortcut to open up the scripting, your documentation, and we have the event right here. That's what we're looking for. So it inherits from mono behavior, and we're going to use the onTriggerEnter event. What this is going to do is call some code whenever the collider enters the trigger, meaning the player collider enters the trigger. So it gives you some example code. Again, notice your different languages up here on the top right. We want to be in C#. We're basically going to redo this code. I'm not going to copy and paste it though because I do better describing it as we type it out, but it's basically going to look nearly exactly like that. OnTriggerEnter requires one input variable. So what it needs is the actual collider that's colliding with it. And you can call it anything you want, but I'm going to call it other, just to keep it in the same syntax as what the example was. Inside of here now, we're going to go ahead and write in some code. So let's think. What do we want to happen? When the player collides with the collectible, we want the collectible to disappear. Well, in Visual Basic, we can only hide and show different objects. In Unity, what's nice is that we can actually destroy the object. We have an event for that called destroy. If we want to destroy an object, since this script is attached to the game object we want to destroy, instead of using me like we did in Visual Basic to reference itself, we want to use game object. Notice the capitalization in game object. There's two different ones. We want to use the one with lowercase game, capital object. Capitalization is key here. So what this is saying is when the player or some object collides with the collectible, it's going to destroy itself. Whatever's in parentheses here, we could destroy. For example, we could destroy the player if we wanted to. But maybe if you wanted the player to avoid objects, we could do it that way. But for now, we just want it to collect it, so we'll destroy the game object itself, aka the collectible. If we save this, we can test it. Again, wait for the program to compile. There's no errors down in our console. We can play test. I can move my player sphere around. When I hit the cube, if I can hit it, it's harder than I thought. There we go. Definitely hit it that time. Okay, I can try it again. Didn't look like I hit it first couple times, but I definitely did. My depth perception isn't the best. So what I want to do next is add some more interactivity with my collectible. For example, I want it to be very apparent that the player is supposed to collect this object. So I'm going to put a constant rotation on the object, very similar to the cubes that are in Mario Kart, how they are always rotating. The way to do that is to go back into our script, and we left this update method. So this is going to be called every frame. And what I want my object to do is rotate every frame. So since this script, again, is on our collectible, we don't have to get the object. We can go straight into grabbing one of the components. For example, I want the object to rotate, and that's part of the transform component. So I'm going to grab the transform of the object, and then I'm going to rotate it, and it's asking for a vector 3. Now a vector 3 could be a position, but in this case it's going to be a rotation. So we need a new keyword, vector 3, and the vector 3 that we're going to use deals with 3 floats, meaning 3 decimal values that represent a rotation around each axis. If we want to type in a float, we need to make sure that we use an F after the number. If we just type in a 45, that's going to automatically mean an int. So it does take float values, so just to turn it into a float, we just put an F. And I'm going to rotate it in 45 degrees every direction. Now to make sure that it's frame rate independent, meaning that it doesn't matter whether you're running on a computer that can run at 60 frames per second or one that can run at 30 frames per second, we need to make sure that we multiply any type of movement by time dot delta time, and this is the change in time between frames. Alright, we can go ahead and save this. If you want a different speed of rotation, you can definitely feel free to change these values around. Alright, looks like my scripts have compiled, we have no errors, and now when I run the game, bam, the collectible is rotating. Again, I can move the player sphere. When I hit the collectible, bam, disappears. Okay, looks like we got a pretty decent game going on here. What I'm going to show you guys next is how to create a prefab for this collectible. It is possible to just right-click on the collectible up in the hierarchy view and just duplicate a bunch of times. However, one nice thing about this program is that we want to keep the limit of our objects that we have in the game as small as possible and just make clones of them. So the way that we do that is to create what's called a prefab or a prefabrication. So we want to keep, again, our assets organized. So we're actually going to create a prefabs folder. Okay, the naming convention is normally pre is capitalized and fabs is capitalized. To create a prefab, we just make sure we have a folder selected. Right now it's empty. And to create the clone, we just grab the collectible and bring it down into the empty folder. A couple things are going to happen. Notice that the collectible is now down here represented by an object icon. And then the collectible in the hierarchy view actually turns blue. That tells you that there is a prefab made for that object. If we want to create clones, the easiest way to do it is either to grab the collectible from the prefabs folder and bring it into the hierarchy view, or you can bring it into your scene view. So I'll do that a few times, bring out some collectibles, place them where I want it. Notice that when I do bring them out and place them in the scene view, they're really inside of the level. That's not really what I want to happen. So looking at my original collectible, it has a Y value close to 1. So I'm actually going to select all of these collectibles and change the Y value to 1. Since the Y-axis is the up and down direction, it provides the same height for all my objects. So it's standard throughout the game. Alright, if we playtest, we now see that all of our cubes or collectibles are rotating. And now when I move the sphere around, since each collectible item has its own script, not all of them are destroyed when I hit, only itself is destroyed. And again, that's the line of code that says destroy, and then in parentheses we have game object, because it's only that single game object it's destroying. Our game is still pretty bland, so we're going to create some materials and colors very similar to what we did with the practice tutorials where we were importing the terrain assets and adding materials. So again, we want to keep our assets nice and organized, so we'll create a new folder called materials. And then inside of my materials folder, I'll create a new material. So if I want to change the color of the floor, I'm going to create a material for that color. So I'll change it to green. Make sure you have the material selected. Open up the material in the inspector panel. We're going to leave our texture blank, but we're going to change the main color. So if we click there, I'm going to change it to a dark green type of color. And again, a couple ways you can change a material on an object is to either click the object and drag the material into the component menu, or you can drag it onto the object in the hierarchy view, or the best way, I think, is to drop it into the scene view, which gives you a preview of what the object would look like. When I bring it around to all the different objects, it actually shows what it's going to look like. So I'm going to drop it on the floor. Gives me a nice green background on the floor. I'm going to create a new material, and I'm just going to change colors of all my other objects. I'm going to create a color for black, and I will put that on my wall objects. So we have a black border going around. Very nice. And my favorite color is orange, so I'll incorporate that, and I will put an orange color on my collectible items. Now, I could go around and take this material and add it to each of my collectibles individually, but say you had 100 of these. That's kind of time consuming. So the easiest way to do it is in your prefabs folder. Remember we made a prefab to clone our collectible. We can just make sure we have this selected in the inspector, go back to our materials, pick the color you want, drop it into this menu or inspector on the right, and it'll apply it to all the collectibles. Makes it very time efficient. Next, I'm going to create a material for our player sphere, and I'll make him yellow. Voila! When I playtest, makes it a lot more colorful, makes it pop, easier to see where the edges of the objects are.